When the world remembers America's role in the Second World War, the images are familiar. The storm of steel at Omaha Beach, the raising of the flag atop Iwo Jima, the B-17s droning toward Berlin. But history, as told to the public, is often a stage lit only from the front. Behind the glare of combat lay a far greater web of invisible effort. Engineers, scientists, codebreakers, artists, spies, and ordinary citizens whose work turned the tide of the war long before a single soldier stepped ashore in Normandy. It began in silence. Before Pearl Harbor, before the draft swelled the ranks of the Army, a small circle of American minds foresaw that science would decide the next great war. In 1938, as Europe drifted toward catastrophe, a handful of physicists, mathematicians, and industrialists began building a secret scientific network across the United States. They were not soldiers. They were men of equations and blueprints, yet they would arm the Republic with the invisible weapons that would shape modern warfare. One of them was Vannevar Bush, an engineer from MIT, and perhaps the most influential man in America that most Americans never knew. Bush understood that the coming conflict would be a war of machines and measurements. He persuaded President Roosevelt to create a new organization, the National Defense Research Committee, which would coordinate all scientific research for military purposes. Under his direction, laboratories across the nation would soon work not for profit or prestige, but for survival. Among Bush's allies was Alfred Loomis, a millionaire banker turned scientist. Loomis owned an estate at Tuxedo Park, New York, where he built one of the most advanced private laboratories in the world. Long before radar became a military secret, Loomis's Tower Room laboratory was experimenting with the principles of radio detection. He spent his own fortune funding experiments that would later form the foundation of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the so-called Rad Lab. When the war began, this quiet partnership between academia and the military would change the course of history. The Rad Lab's work produced portable radar sets that could be mounted on aircraft and ships. It gave bombers the ability to see through clouds, and naval commanders the power to track targets in the dark. These inventions did not make headlines. They were wrapped in layers of classification. Yet every Allied victory after 1942 bore their fingerprints. In those early years, secrecy became America's new language. Every invention, every experiment, every signal was coded, compartmentalized, or hidden under code names that meant nothing to outsiders. A single radar unit might be referred to as a microwave transmitter, its true purpose known only to a few. Laboratories used windowless rooms. Scientists spoke in fragments. The enemy was not the only one to be kept in the dark, so were many of the people creating the weapons themselves. This obsession with secrecy spread across the country as war approached. When Roosevelt issued the call for mobilization, America responded not just with men and guns but with intelligence. Hidden agencies began to take shape, the precursors of the modern national security state. At the heart of this transformation was the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, created in 1942 under the direction of General William Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan's idea was simple: to unite espionage, sabotage, and propaganda into one coordinated effort. For a country that had never maintained a formal intelligence service, it was a revolutionary step. The OSS recruited academics, linguists, refugees, and adventurers. Its training camps were hidden deep in Virginia and Maryland, disguised as ordinary estates. There, future spies learned how to pick locks, handle explosives, and blend into enemy cities. They were taught that silence was the first weapon of intelligence. Their files were burned after missions, their names erased. Among the more unusual divisions of the OSS was its research and development branch, which produced gadgets worthy of a spy novel. Exploding coal lumps meant to sabotage trains, cigarettes laced with toxins, cameras small enough to fit in matchboxes. But one of the strangest projects was called Operation Fantasia, an attempt to terrify Japanese troops by exploiting folklore. The idea: coat foxes with luminescent paint and release them near enemy positions, where their glowing forms would be mistaken for ghostly spirits. The project never made it past the planning stage, but it captures the atmosphere of wartime creativity, where no idea was too absurd if it might help win. The OSS's work would later form the backbone of the CIA, but its roots in World War II were as improvisational as they were secretive. While spies trained in shadow, Scientists worked under lightless ceilings. The year was 1942. The war in Europe was raging, and across the Pacific, the Japanese Empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. America was fighting 2 wars across 2 oceans, and already a 3rd war had begun, one fought in laboratories, where physicists and engineers raced to unlock the power of the atom. That project, born in silence, was called Manhattan. The Manhattan Project began with a letter. In 1939, Albert Einstein and physicist Leo Szilard warned President Roosevelt that Germany might be developing an atomic bomb. Their letter set off a chain reaction, not of fission but of bureaucracy and urgency. Within 2 years, the U.S. Army had launched the largest scientific undertaking in human history. At its peak, more than 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, spread across more than 30 sites across the country. Entire cities, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico, were built from scratch, fenced off, and erased from maps. Workers were told only what they needed to know. At Oak Ridge, young women spent 12-hour shifts turning dials on mysterious machines. They had no idea that the numbers they watched measured uranium enrichment. The secrecy was total. Even Vice President Truman knew nothing of the project until he became president in April 1945. The men and women of these hidden towns lived double lives, ordinary citizens in extraordinary isolation. They were told their work was for the war, and that was enough. At Los Alamos, under the leadership of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientists wrestled with questions no one had ever faced before. Could the energy of the atom be harnessed without destroying the planet? Could such a weapon be used ethically? The debates were endless, but the orders were clear: finish before the Germans do. The first test came on July 16, 1945, at Alamogordo, New Mexico. When the desert night turned to daylight and the mountains trembled, Oppenheimer recalled the words of Scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb was ready, but the Manhattan Project's hidden legacy extended far beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It transformed the relationship between science and the state. Never before had American industry, academia, and the military collaborated on such a scale. When the war ended, that model, the military-industrial complex, became permanent. The United States would never again return to the simplicity of pre-war science. Yet while atomic energy defined the war's final chapter, it was radar that had made victory possible from the beginning. By 1944, radar was in the air, at sea, and even in the pockets of soldiers as handheld rangefinders. American engineers developed over 100 types of radar systems during the war, from long-range detection to ground mapping. British scientists had pioneered the technology, but it was American production that gave it global reach. In the Pacific, radar turned night into day. It allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz's fleets to ambush Japanese convoys under darkness. It protected carriers from surprise attacks and guided aircraft through storms. On D-Day, radar on the English coast tracked every ship of the Allied invasion fleet as it crossed the Channel. The Germans had radar too, but they lacked the scale. American factories could produce in a week what the Reich could barely assemble in a month. Technology alone was never enough. It was quantity, adaptability, and the willingness to experiment that defined American power. And yet, even this immense technological achievement was hidden from the public eye. After the war, thousands of engineers who had worked on radar projects were told to forget what they knew. Technical documents were classified. Even within families, veterans of the radar war remained silent for decades. The secrecy had become habit, a second nature formed under the pressure of necessity. While scientists labored under lock and key, another kind of secret battle was taking place, not in laboratories or skies, but in the cryptic world of signals and ciphers. The American codebreakers of World War II worked in silence, often in windowless rooms filled with clattering typewriters and machines. Their mission: to read the enemy's mail without ever being seen. They were mathematicians, linguists, and women recruited from universities, libraries, and even clerical jobs. Few wore uniforms, yet their contribution was as decisive as any army. Their greatest triumph came before the Battle of Midway in 1942. Japanese naval communications used a code called JN-25, thought to be unbreakable, but at a secret station in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort's team cracked it. By intercepting and decoding messages, they learned that the Japanese were planning to attack an island known only by the code AF. To confirm, Rochefort sent a fake message reporting that Midway's water supply was low. When the Japanese repeated the same information in their encrypted messages, the trap was sprung. The U.S. Navy prepared an ambush. In the ensuing battle, 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed, crippling Japan's offensive power and changing the course of the Pacific War. Yet Rochefort's success was buried by bureaucracy and politics. His superiors denied him recognition, and he was quietly reassigned after the battle. His work remained classified for decades. Only in the 1980s did the U.S. Navy publicly honor him. While American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor were breaking Japanese naval codes, another secret team in Washington, D.C., the Signal Intelligence Service, or SIS, was working on the diplomatic codes used by Japan's Foreign Office. Their breakthrough, known as magic, allowed Washington to read Japanese messages almost as quickly as Tokyo itself. The intelligence it provided shaped nearly every major decision in the Pacific Theater. These codebreakers, many of them young women fresh out of college, worked tirelessly in total anonymity. They couldn't tell their families what they did, not even after the war. Some went to their graves without ever revealing their role. It would take nearly half a century before their stories were finally declassified. Their counterparts in the Pacific, the Navajo code talkers, added another layer of secrecy, one that no machine could penetrate. Using their native language, they developed a code that was fast, secure, and utterly indecipherable to the Japanese. At Iwo Jima alone, Navajo code talkers sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. The enemy never broke it. Their service remained unrecognized until 1968, when their mission was finally declassified. Many had already passed away, never knowing the gratitude of the nation they served in silence. The Second World War is remembered through grand images: the Normandy landings, the flag on Iwo Jima, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. But beneath those vast and public moments lies another layer, a hidden one. A story of unseen innovation, quiet acts of bravery, and decisions made in silence that would shape not just the war, but the entire American century that followed. This is that story, the one history rarely pauses to tell. In 1941, as the United States moved toward inevitable involvement in the war, the nation stood in a paradox. It was rich in resources, full of talent but unprepared for modern global warfare. The Army ranked 17th in size, behind Portugal. Many Americans still remembered the last war and wanted no part of another. Yet inside quiet offices and anonymous workshops, a transformation was beginning. It wasn't just about tanks or rifles. It was about minds, engineers, scientists, and thinkers who saw war as a problem to be solved. One of those hidden figures was Vannevar Bush, a soft-spoken engineer who understood that America's strength would not only come from its factories, but from its laboratories. In June 1940, he convinced President Franklin Roosevelt to create the National Defense Research Committee, and later, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. This office would become the nervous system of America's wartime science, a secret government link between the universities, the military and private industry. From radar to penicillin, from atomic theory to computing, it all flowed through that one small group of men, working in the shadows of history. The American war machine that stormed Normandy in 1944 was not born on the battlefield. It was born in the halls of MIT, in the Bell Telephone Laboratories, in places like Los Alamos, where the world's greatest minds were locked behind barbed wire, racing against time and secrecy, and yet, while their names would later emerge, countless others did not. Unknown scientists, inventors, and field engineers whose ideas quietly changed the course of the war, and who returned home without medals or parades. One such innovation began not in a lab, but in the cold Atlantic in the battle against the U-boats. In 1942, German submarines prowled the American coast almost unchecked. Entire tankers burned off Cape Hatteras. The United States was losing ships faster than it could build them. The Atlantic, once the world's busiest trade route, had become a graveyard of steel. Desperation bred creativity. The U.S. Navy turned to physicists and oceanographers, people who had never worn uniforms but knew the laws of sound. From this unlikely collaboration came the magnetic anomaly detector and the refinement of sonar, known then as ASDIC. But even more quietly, a new weapon was born: the acoustic torpedo. Codenamed Fido, it was the world's first homing torpedo, designed to listen for the propeller sounds of German subs. Dropped from aircraft, it could seek out its prey underwater, turning the hunter into the hunted. Few knew of its existence then, and fewer still realized how decisive it became. Of the hundreds of U-boats destroyed late in the war, dozens fell to this unseen invention, a creation that no newspaper could report, and no sailor would ever see until decades later. America's strength was not only in numbers, but in the unseen network behind those numbers. Factories retooled overnight. Civilian car plants turned out tanks. Typewriter companies made machine guns, and behind every product was a secret partnership between the industrialists who knew how to mass produce and the scientists who knew what to make. One of the most secret partnerships took place in the fields of Maryland. Here, the U.S. Army built a sprawling facility known only as Edgewood Arsenal, a place of chemical experimentation. The horrors of gas warfare from World War I had left an indelible scar, and though the Geneva Protocol outlawed it, no power fully abandoned the idea. At Edgewood, American scientists quietly studied both defense and offense. They tested protective gear, antidotes, and delivery systems. Some research crossed into disturbing ethical gray zones, where soldiers were unknowingly exposed to small doses of gas to test resilience and effectiveness. The work was grim, but its results saved lives in Europe and the Pacific. American soldiers went into combat with the best gas masks and protective suits in the world, because others had taken those risks before them. These are the moral shadows of war, the kind that history often glosses over, but which shaped the unseen reality of survival. In another corner of secrecy, the war's codebreakers worked in silence. While Britain's Bletchley Park became legendary, America's own efforts were equally decisive and far less publicized. At Arlington Hall in Virginia, thousands of American cryptanalysts, many of them young women, worked around the clock breaking Japanese and German codes. Their greatest triumph came from cracking the Japanese diplomatic cipher, known as Purple. The intelligence derived from Purple, along with the Navy's magic intercepts, changed the course of the Pacific War. It allowed American forces to anticipate Japanese movements, protect convoys, and plan offensives with uncanny precision. But the price was silence. These women, linguists, mathematicians, typists, were sworn to secrecy for decades. Their contributions remained classified long after the war ended. It wasn't until the 1990s that the government formally acknowledged their service. They never appeared in the photos of victory parades. But their invisible hands turned the tide at Midway at Guadalcanal and across the vast Pacific expanse. As America waged war through science and secrecy, another unseen battle unfolded, one of psychology and deception. The U.S. Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, now known as the Ghost Army, was a unit like no other. Composed of artists, designers, and sound engineers, their mission was to create illusions, fake armies, fake convoys, fake radio chatter, with inflatable tanks, loudspeakers playing recorded sounds of movement, and carefully crafted camouflage. They fooled German reconnaissance repeatedly. One of their greatest feats came before the crossing of the Rhine in 1945, when they simulated a major army group miles away from the real assault point. The deception drew German forces away from the true target, saving thousands of lives. Their weapons were not bullets or bombs, they were imagination, paint, and sound. The Ghost Army's work remained secret for 50 years, classified long after the guns fell silent. Only in recent years were its members recognized, many of them elderly men who had spent their lives unable to tell their families what they had done. Beneath the battlefield, another American innovation was taking shape, one that would quietly define the modern world: the beginnings of computing. At the University of Pennsylvania, two brilliant engineers, J. Presper Eckert and John Mauchly, built the ENIAC, the world's first true electronic computer. Its initial purpose was purely military, to calculate artillery firing tables for the U.S. Army. What began as a wartime necessity became a revolution in thought. ENIAC could compute thousands of times faster than any human, and though few realized it then, It was the prototype for every computer that followed. Behind every precision strike, every radar track, every bomb trajectory, there was a human mind trying to outthink chaos. That was the hidden war, a war not just of men and machines, but of intellect, secrecy, and silent endurance. The story of America's hidden war is also a story of people. Ordinary citizens whose quiet roles became extraordinary under the weight of global conflict. In New Mexico, young women operated switchboards for atomic scientists. In Chicago, physicists worked beneath the stands of an unused football stadium, building the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction. In rural Pennsylvania, farmers unknowingly lived near underground ammunition depots holding more explosives than they could imagine. The nation had turned itself into an engine of secrecy, and its greatest weapon was not the atom bomb. It was organization, coordination, and willpower. As the months turned into years, the United States became a fortress of industry. By 1944, American factories were producing half the world's munitions. Every minute, a new machine gun. Every hour, a new tank. Every day, a new ship. Yet even that scale was sustained by invisible labor. The workers who never saw the front lines but powered them. The unknown soldier was not only the man who fell on a battlefield, but also the woman in a factory, the scientist in a lab, the codebreaker in a sealed room. Their world was one of secrecy and trust, where mistakes could cost lives across oceans. They rarely received recognition, but without them, victory would have been impossible. By 1943, the United States had become a country of secrets within secrets. Factories ran day and night, but behind them were doors marked restricted. Not every worker knew what they were building. Not every general knew where a weapon came from. Compartmentalization, need to know, became the governing principle of a nation at war. Among those compartments was a new organization so secret that even members of Congress had only vague notions of its purpose. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Created by presidential order in June 1942 and led by a scholarly soldier named William J. Donovan, the OSS would become the ancestor of the modern CIA. But in its early days, it was little more than an experiment. Could a democratic nation, suspicious of intrigue, learn to fight a silent war of deception and espionage? The answer came slowly and at great risk. The OSS recruited professors, journalists, filmmakers, athletes, linguists, anyone with a skill that could serve abroad. They trained in hidden camps scattered across Maryland and Virginia, learning how to use explosives disguised as coal, how to forge papers, how to disappear. It was a world America had never officially inhabited before. The world of the spy. In Europe, OSS agents infiltrated occupied France, parachuting in under cover of darkness to contact resistance fighters. They carried miniature radios and silk maps that could survive water and fire. Their work prepared the ground for D-Day, gathering details on German troop strength, bridges, and rail lines. Many never returned. Captured agents faced torture or summary execution. The Geneva Conventions offered no protection for a man caught in plain clothes behind enemy lines. Yet from these missions came priceless intelligence. One OSS team helped sabotage the German retreat from southern France. Another relayed information on the movements of V-2 rockets from Peenemünde. Through their reports, Allied bombers struck with uncanny accuracy. Farther east, American intelligence crossed into one of history's most treacherous landscapes, Burma and China. There the enemy was not only Japan, but jungle, disease, and terrain itself. The OSS Detachment 101, a small group of Americans and Kachin tribesmen, fought a hidden war that few outside knew existed. Operating behind Japanese lines, they ambushed convoys, rescued downed airmen, and guided bombing missions through the mountains. At its peak, the detachment controlled large swaths of northern Burma with fewer than 1,000 men. Their casualties were high, but their impact enormous. By the end of the war, they had destroyed hundreds of bridges, trains, and enemy camps, quiet victories that shortened the campaign. Back in Washington, another kind of secrecy evolved. Psychologists, sociologists, and filmmakers joined a strange branch of the war effort known today as psychological warfare. Its mission: to understand morale, both the enemy's and America's own. The U.S. Army created units to produce leaflets, radio broadcasts, and films intended not only to inform, but to shape thought. Hollywood lent its best. Directors like Frank Capra and John Ford turned propaganda into education, showing soldiers why they fought, showing civilians what was at stake. The Why We Fight series became compulsory viewing for new recruits. Few realized how deliberate every frame was, a tool for cohesion in a democracy that needed unity. Across the ocean, the same methods took darker forms. The Office of War Information, working with the OSS, prepared leaflets dropped over enemy lines, millions of them, promising fair treatment to those who surrendered, spreading rumors of defeat, confusion, and despair. Radio transmitters broadcast false news bulletins in perfect German, reporting imaginary troop movements or invented disasters. The idea was not to terrify but to erode certainty. An army unsure of truth fights less efficiently. This was a new frontier for America, warfare of the mind. It would outlast the war itself, evolving into the modern world of information campaigns and psychological operations. Amid the vastness of the Pacific, secrecy took yet another form. While Europe's front was dense with nations and borders, the Pacific was scattered across thousands of islands, each a fortress of coral and jungle. There, unknown American units carried out missions that even their fellow servicemen never heard about. One of the most extraordinary was the Naval Group China, a covert organization that combined American sailors with Chinese guerrillas. Their task was sabotage and intelligence along the Chinese coast, mining harbors, rescuing pilots, relaying weather reports for B-29 raids. They operated under constant risk. Capture meant death, yet their intelligence saved countless air crews navigating monsoon storms and enemy fighters. Equally hidden were the Alamo Scouts in the Philippines. These were hand-picked reconnaissance teams, only 138 men in total, who penetrated enemy lines before major assaults. They brought back maps, prisoner information, and radio intercepts that allowed the U.S. Sixth Army to strike precisely. In more than 100 missions, they never lost a single man in combat, an achievement still unmatched. Their greatest success came in 1945 with the Cabanatuan raid. Working with Filipino guerrillas and the U.S. Rangers, they helped free over 500 Allied prisoners from a Japanese camp deep behind enemy lines. It was a perfect coordination of intelligence and courage, a mission so precise it lasted barely half an hour, but saved hundreds from certain death. The world celebrated the rescue, but few knew who had planned it. The Alamo Scouts' records remained classified for decades. Behind these field victories lay hidden logistics, an invisible infrastructure stretching from California to Okinawa. Every weapon, every bullet had to travel thousands of miles. To maintain the flow, the Navy and Merchant Marine developed systems of underway replenishment, refueling and rearming ships in the middle of the ocean. It was an American invention born of necessity, turning the Pacific into a highway of supply. Without it, the island-hopping campaign could never have moved so swiftly. The details were secret then. Even sailors aboard one ship often didn't know the scope of the network. Tankers met carriers in precise coordinates under radio silence. Nighttime operations were lit only by moon and discipline. It was dangerous, repetitive work, but it changed naval warfare forever. Another logistical secret lay under the waves. In 1943, the U.S. Navy began experimenting with midget submarines and frogmen, the forerunners of today's Navy SEALs. The unit, called Underwater Demolition Teams, trained in Florida and Hawaii. Their mission was to survey beaches ahead of invasions, clearing mines and obstacles. They swam miles in silence, carrying explosives on their backs, mapping coasts that would soon see the landings of thousands. Many were killed before they ever fired a shot, but the intelligence they gathered saved entire divisions from disaster. Their existence remained largely unknown until years after the war. Back home, secrecy demanded something else: control of information. The American public was eager for news, but what they received was carefully filtered through censorship offices in Washington and San Francisco. Every photograph, every letter from the front passed under watchful eyes. It wasn't about hiding defeat. It was about maintaining morale and preventing intelligence leaks. Even weather reports were restricted. Too much information could aid the enemy's submarines. Among the most tightly guarded secrets was the Manhattan Project. But outside of Los Alamos, a parallel project existed that few remember. Project WWII service schools, where thousands of technicians were trained without ever being told what their work meant. They assembled components, machined metals, calculated trajectories, never knowing they were building the core of an atomic bomb. The phrase, "the project was enough." Questions were discouraged. Only on August 6, 1945, when newspapers printed the words "Hiroshima destroyed by new weapon," did many realize what their anonymous labor had achieved. Some celebrated, others could not sleep. The hidden war had many victories but few absolutes. Secrecy reached even into the skies. In 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces quietly tested a weapon that seems like science fiction, the Bat Bomb. Developed under Project X-Ray, it proposed to attach tiny incendiary charges to hibernating bats, release them over Japanese cities at dawn, and let them roost in wooden buildings before the charges ignited. The idea came from a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle Adams, after he saw bats in New Mexico caves. The concept was bizarre, but in testing it worked. A simulated village built at a Utah proving ground burned to the ground. The project was eventually canceled in favor of the atomic program, but it remains a symbol of how far wartime creativity could go when limits were suspended. Similarly strange was Project Habakkuk, a joint British-American plan to build aircraft carriers from ice reinforced with wood pulp. The hope was to create unsinkable floating runways in the North Atlantic. American engineers at New York's Naval Yard tested the material, pykrete, and found it remarkably strong. Ultimately, the project proved impractical, but the research paved the way for composite materials used decades later. Such experiments remind us that war accelerates imagination at a cost. Countless ideas, many unfeasible, each demanding secrecy, resources, and belief. As 1944 turned to 1945, America's unseen network reached its peak. Millions served, but the number of people cleared for top-secret work was still tiny, barely a fraction of 1%. They carried the nation's most sensitive knowledge without ever discussing it. When the war ended, they returned to civilian life, taking silence with them. The OSS was dissolved. The laboratories shifted to peacetime research. The vast censorship apparatus shut down almost overnight. Yet the habits of secrecy, the disciplines of coordination remained. They would define the coming Cold War as surely as any bomb or plane. What endures from that hidden struggle is not only the machinery of intelligence, but a pattern of mind. The idea that information itself is a weapon. From the codebreakers of Arlington Hall to the frogmen of the Pacific, from Hollywood propagandists to mathematicians wiring the first computers, America learned in those years how knowledge, guarded and directed, could change history. That lesson carried a double edge: progress built on silence, innovation born in fear, ethics suspended for victory. It is the unseen inheritance of the Second World War, carried forward by generations who never knew the names of those who built it. By the final winter of 1944, the American war machine had reached a level of complexity never seen in human history. Victory now depended not only on soldiers and ships, but on the quiet pulse of technology. New instruments that allowed men to see farther, heal faster, and kill with a precision no previous generation could imagine. These were the hidden tools of triumph, many still buried under the dust of secrecy. Among the most decisive of these was radar. The idea was simple: invisible radio waves bouncing off metal objects. But to turn theory into a battlefield system required engineering genius and vast coordination. Before America entered the war, radar was largely British. The chain of coastal stations had saved Britain in 1940. Yet once the United States joined, it transformed radar from a defensive shield into an offensive instrument. At the radiation laboratory at MIT, called the Rad Lab, physicists and engineers, many barely out of graduate school, worked around the clock refining microwave technology. They produced compact sets small enough to fit inside a bomber's nose, precise enough to guide night fighters through cloud and darkness. The SCR-584 radar, born in those rooms, became the silent guardian of Allied skies during the Normandy landings, tracking enemy aircraft and directing anti-aircraft guns with mathematical accuracy. Few outside knew that a third of America's wartime research budget flowed through the Rad Lab. Even fewer knew that the entire microwave oven of the post-war era was an accidental byproduct of one scientist's radar experiment. A candy bar. melted in his pocket while he adjusted a magnetron tube, and the world quietly changed. The same pursuit of precision transformed medicine. When the United States entered the war, infection still killed more soldiers than bullets. On distant islands and in frozen forests, a scratch could mean death from gangrene. But in 1943, a quiet miracle began to move from laboratory to battlefield: penicillin. The drug had been discovered years earlier by Alexander Fleming, yet producing it in quantities large enough to matter seemed impossible. American scientists at the Department of Agriculture and pharmaceutical firms like Pfizer took up the challenge. They developed a deep fermentation process using corn-steeped liquor, turning a fragile mold into a global lifesaver. By D-Day, American factories were producing more than 2 million doses a month. Entire hospitals in Europe and the Pacific ran on the rhythm of its distribution. Soldiers who once would have died from infection walked out of field tents within days. It was one of the war's quiet revolutions, a victory not of firepower but of science, serving life amid death. Another revolution was born in blood itself. Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon and researcher, perfected the method of preserving plasma so it could be shipped overseas. His work built the first large-scale blood bank, saving tens of thousands. Yet racial segregation in the WWII Army's medical system forced him to resign in protest, a reminder that even in a war for freedom, equality was still unfinished. His techniques, however, endured. Every modern blood transfusion traces back to that wartime effort. As American technology raced forward, so too did its moral boundaries. In deserts, jungles, and remote laboratories, scientists explored ideas that walked the line between defense and destruction. At the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, chemical weapons were tested under conditions mimicking Europe. The purpose was defensive, to know how to protect troops, but the methods were harsh. Livestock, sometimes entire herds, were exposed to measured dosage and effect. Field reports were sealed for decades. Few participants spoke afterward, yet their data shaped the development of protective suits and filters still used by modern soldiers. In the Pacific, another kind of secrecy unfolded in the search for victory against an enemy whose tactics defied conventional war. American engineers studied captured Japanese fortifications and weapons with obsessive detail, learning how to breach caves and tunnels. Out of this research came napalm, a substance whose name, naphthenic and palmitic acids, hid its horror. Created at Harvard by chemist Louis Fieser, it clung to surfaces and burned with unrelenting heat. On the battlefields of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it became a grim instrument, clearing bunkers where conventional explosives failed. Fieser rarely spoke of it afterward. His invention, like so many others, belonged to that moral twilight where necessity and conscience collide. The boundary was crossed most dramatically in the mountains of New Mexico. There, in a place called Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project gathered some of the greatest minds of the century. They lived behind barbed wire, under false names, surrounded by desert silence. To the outside world, the town did not exist. To the few who entered, it was a crucible of secrecy. Within its gates worked physicists who had fled fascism, and young Americans barely aware of what they were building. Under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, they pursued an idea that promised to end all wars by unleashing the energy hidden inside the atom. Everything about the project defied precedent: the scale of construction, the level of classification, the sheer concentration of intellect. Laboratories in Chicago, Hanford, and Oak Ridge fed material to Los Alamos, where calculations determined the fate of cities. The bomb they built was the most guarded secret in American history. Even Vice President Truman knew nothing until the spring of 1945. When the first device detonated at Trinity, the desert turned to daylight. The shockwave flattened steel towers and hearts alike. Oppenheimer remembered a line from Scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." For the scientists watching, victory and guilt were inseparable. Many had joined to stop Hitler. Now the target was Japan, and the weapon beyond imagination. Some argued for a demonstration, others for immediate use. The decision was made above them, in rooms where politics and exhaustion ruled. On August 6th and 9th, the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended, but the hidden war had birthed a new age. In quieter corners of the military, secrecy turned toward survival. The Air Transport Command organized routes that circled the globe, supplying far-flung fronts with parts and medicine. Crews flew through weather no one yet understood. To improve forecasts, American meteorologists built a worldwide observation system, the first of its kind. It was classified then. Today, it forms the backbone of modern global weather data. High above, new devices transform flight. The proximity fuse, a tiny radar set inside a shell, allowed anti-aircraft rounds to detonate when close to a target rather than on impact. It multiplied defensive firepower and saved untold ships from kamikaze attacks. Its existence remained secret until after victory. Even captured American troops were forbidden to mention it under threat of court-martial. On the ground, portable radar called SCR-300 gave infantry real-time communication, what we now call the walkie-talkie. Small, rugged, weighing 35 pounds, it linked platoons under fire and turned chaotic fields into coordinated movements. Generals credited it with changing tactics more than any single weapon. Each invention was a fragment of an unseen pattern, the fusion of science, industry, and organization that defined the American way of war. It was a network, not a single genius, a collaboration of thousands whose names never appeared in textbooks. Secrecy also shaped the medical front in less visible ways. In hospitals from Normandy to New Guinea, doctors faced wounds no textbooks covered: burns from flamethrowers, blast injuries from new explosives, trauma from tropical diseases. The Army Medical Research Division documented every case, creating data that would birth modern trauma medicine. Field surgeons invented portable surgical units, precursors to the MASH systems of Korea and Vietnam. Every technique of modern emergency care, triage, blood plasma, sterile packaging, traces back to those improvisations. Yet the pressure to innovate sometimes crossed lines of consent. Prison volunteers and unknowing soldiers were exposed to extreme temperatures, malaria, mustard gas, to test limits of endurance. The justification was always the same: lives saved in battle. The legacy is more complicated: progress entwined with pain. While scientists worked in isolation, artists continued their quiet contribution. The U.S. Army Camouflage Branch recruited painters, architects, and sculptors to disguise installations. Entire airfields vanished under nets of painted burlap and wire. Ships were covered in dazzle patterns, bold stripes designed to confuse rangefinders. What began as art became mathematics of perception, studied long after the war by psychologists and designers. In New York, musicians composed signals, short melodies broadcast on Allied frequencies to identify friendly stations. Hollywood technicians improved color film stock for reconnaissance photography. Even comic strip artists were hired to draw manuals that could teach illiterate recruits how to clean a rifle or patch a wound. The war blurred every boundary between creativity and survival. Through 1945, the machine kept running, though many inside it sensed the end approaching. Factories still poured steel. Laboratories still guarded files stamped top secret. But the silence grew heavier. Workers began to ask what would happen when peace returned. Could this vast architecture of secrecy simply disappear? The answer was no. It had become too integrated, too effective. Out of wartime necessity emerged the foundations of the modern security state. The OSS gave birth to the Central Intelligence Agency. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service became the National Security Agency. Laboratories once devoted to radar now studied nuclear energy and spaceflight. The invisible war had remade America's identity. By the time victory was declared, millions celebrated in the streets, but for many who had served in secret, there were no parades. They returned to quiet jobs carrying knowledge they could never discuss. Some buried it, others turned it into new industries: computing, aviation, electronics. The age of consumer technology was the child of wartime secrecy. In every refrigerator circuit, every weather satellite, every hospital antibiotic, there is a trace of that hidden war. The inventions meant to win battles went on to shape peace itself. But behind each, a question lingers. What does it cost a free society to keep so many secrets? When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world celebrated the end of the deadliest conflict in history. Flags waved in Times Square, bands played, strangers kissed in the streets. But beyond the noise of victory, another silence began, the silence of secrecy, of stories locked behind vault doors and classified files. For every soldier who came home to parades, there were thousands whose service could not be spoken of, men who had worked in code rooms, laboratories, listening posts, and ghost units, women who had intercepted messages, mapped targets, or plotted deception campaigns. Their war did not end with surrender. It dissolved quietly into the structure of post-war America. The world they returned to had changed in ways few could see. The hidden systems of intelligence, logistics, and technology that had carried the United States to victory would not be dismantled. They would evolve and define the age that followed. In Washington, new agencies rose from wartime shadows. The Office of Strategic Services, which had coordinated sabotage, espionage, and psychological warfare, was dissolved only briefly before being reborn in 1947 as the Central Intelligence Agency. Many of its first officers came directly from the fields of Europe and Asia, men trained under the OSS creed of unorthodox thinking and covert power. Their wartime lessons, infiltration, information, influence, became the pillars of Cold War strategy. From their experiences in occupied France and the Pacific Islands grew an understanding that information could be as decisive as firepower. The idea that a nation's security could depend not just on armies but on secrets. America had entered the war a democracy of openness. It emerged a global power wrapped in classification. The National Security Act of 1947 created not only the CIA but also the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and a permanent Air Force. It was the official birth of the modern national security state, a structure built from the bones of the hidden war. At the same time, the invisible infrastructure of global communication continued to expand. Wartime radar networks became weather and navigation systems. The radio intercept stations that had listened for U-boats now listened for foreign broadcasts. The cryptographic machines once used to break Japanese and German codes were repurposed to monitor the messages of new adversaries. In Moscow, in Beijing, in Berlin. And behind them, the scientists who had worked in wartime secrecy were now leading a revolution in computation. The codebreakers of Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall had built machines to automate logic itself. From their prototypes came the first true computers, ENIAC, UNIVAC, massive, humming boxes that filled entire rooms and ran on the mathematics of war. These early machines had been created to calculate artillery trajectories and nuclear equations. But soon they were applied to weather prediction, banking, and engineering. The digital world began quietly as a continuation of the hidden war, the logical extension of America's drive to mechanize secrecy. For the men and women who had lived inside those shadows, the adjustment to peace was complex. Many had been bound by lifelong oaths of silence. Those who served in the Ghost Army could not tell anyone what they had done until their mission was declassified decades later. Veterans of code-breaking units like the Women's Army Corps detachment at Arlington Hall kept their contributions secret even from their families. Some went to their graves believing their service would never be known. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the scale of their work became public. When the National Archives declassified documents in the 1980s and 1990s, historians discovered just how vast America's secret war had been, a parallel military as large as the visible one. Entire research divisions, listening posts, and operations had existed in silence. Their story was America's unseen victory, but not all secrets stayed buried. Some spilled into the open in ways no one could have predicted. The nuclear age that began at Los Alamos reshaped not only warfare but politics, culture, and conscience. For the first time, humanity could destroy itself in minutes. The same engineers who had built the atomic bomb were now asked to build bigger ones, and to find ways to defend against them. Operation after operation grew out of that fear. Underground test sites in Nevada and the Pacific, atomic-powered submarines, missile silos hidden in the Midwest, all extensions of the wartime secrecy system. The United States had mastered the art of concealment during the Second World War, and it carried that mastery into the Cold War. Even the landscape bore traces of this inheritance. Airfields built for B-29 bombers became bases for jet aircraft. Radar towers evolved into early warning systems against nuclear attack. The scientists who had developed the first proximity fuses now built guidance systems for intercontinental missiles. Every innovation was a thread leading back to that feverish wartime race, when victory had depended on thinking faster, building smarter, and keeping secrets tighter than anyone else. In universities, wartime research had transformed American science. The government's investment in radar, rocketry, and nuclear physics had created a generation of scientists who believed that government and research could not be separated. The Office of Naval Research, founded in 1946, and the National Science Foundation, created in 1950, grew directly from wartime laboratories. Civilian life filled with technologies that were once classified. Jet engines carried passengers across oceans in hours. Antibiotics became a routine miracle. Plastics, synthetic rubber, penicillin, radar, and microwave ovens, all had been born from urgent wartime experiments. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would later warn against had its roots not in profit, but in necessity. Yet that necessity never truly ended. The lesson of the hidden war was clear. The future belonged to those who could organize secrecy, manage complexity, and fuse science with strategy. The United States had done it better than anyone, and it would never stop. For ordinary Americans, the memory of the war became simpler, heroic, clear, good versus evil. But beneath that collective memory ran another story, one of moral struggle and technological transformation. A story of how democracy waged total war and emerged changed by it. How secrecy, once a temporary weapon, became a permanent condition. The hidden war had given America power, but also responsibility. It had created the tools of deterrence, surveillance, and global reach. And it had shown how fragile those tools could be if left unchecked. Even the veterans who had served in silence began to reflect on this paradox. Many of them looked back not with regret but with awe, at what had been accomplished, at the scale of human coordination that had turned chaos into victory. But they also carried the weight of knowing what their work had unleashed. The moral line that separated innovation from destruction had blurred forever. By the 1950s, the country had moved on. The economy boomed. Suburbs spread across former training grounds. Television filled living rooms with sanitized war stories. Brave Marines on Pacific beaches. Noble airmen over Europe. The secret half of the war was invisible to the public eye, locked away in files labeled restricted, confidential, top secret. But inside the Pentagon, inside laboratories and intelligence offices, the lineage continued. The networks that had tracked enemy ships now tracked satellites. The psychologists who had studied morale now studied propaganda. The logistical systems that had moved an army across oceans now supplied troops in Korea and Vietnam. The war had ended. The machine had not. In some ways, the hidden war never truly ended at all. It simply changed shape. From battlefields to boardrooms, from laboratories to launch pads. The same American ingenuity that built the Norden bomb sight and the proximity fuse now built microchips and space capsules. The secret world of WWII had become the infrastructure of the modern age. For the few who could still remember its beginning, the transformation was astonishing. In 1941, America had been unprepared, scattered, inward-looking. By 1945, it was the most powerful nation in history. Not just because of its armies, but because of its ability to coordinate secrecy and science on a scale no one had imagined. From codebreakers to chemists, from mapmakers to mathematicians, the hidden army had made it possible. Their legacy lives not in medals or monuments, but in systems that still govern our world. Every radar ping, every encrypted message, every vaccine supply chain, every satellite navigation system, each carries an echo of that unseen effort. A quiet reminder that the victory of 1945 was not won only by those on the front lines, but also by those behind locked doors. The files continue to open, even today. Historians still uncover new details, lost memos, forgotten experiments, photographs of operations once denied. Each revelation adds another piece to the vast mosaic of America's secret war. It is a story without an ending, because its consequences still unfold. The Cold War, the space race, the digital revolution, all trace their ancestry to those frantic wartime years. If the visible war showed what America could build, the hidden war showed what it could imagine. The courage of those who fought was matched by the creativity of those who invented, decoded, and concealed. Together they formed a machine that defeated tyranny and redefined modern civilization. In the end, the unknown stories of World War II are not merely curiosities. They are the blueprint of the world we inhabit, a world wired by secrecy, powered by science, and still haunted by the moral questions first asked in those years. Because behind every headline of victory, there were rooms where the lights never went out. Rooms where ordinary Americans labored in silence, believing that if they succeeded, no one would ever know. And that was the point. The hidden war was fought not for recognition, but for survival. Its legacy endures not in glory, but in everything it made possible. The radar hum, the code, the circuit, the silence, all part of the same invisible inheritance. This is the final truth of America's secret war, that history's greatest triumph was built, in part, by people who were never meant to be remembered.